PRC, but any war with a country like the PRC and military like the PRC is going to involve the exhaustion of munition stockpiles very rapidly. So a big part of the answer to a healthy defense industrial base over time is the ability to regenerate, to surge, to build during a conflict, not just to build before to prepare for a conflict. And that's got to be a key lesson that we take away from what we've seen over the last 3 years on the battlefield in Ukraine.
So one follow-up on this, your sense and level of concern as we've seen greater integration or coordination of the industrial bases of the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese. What does that say about cooperation between them and their industrial bases, and what's the implication then for us?
I'm glad you mentioned that. And when you asked the question, I made a mental note in my head to get to that point because it's a critical point. I didn't do so, although I spoke about it in my remarks. We are seeing concerning flows of capability and know-how among these various actors. You've got Iranian drones going to Russia. Now Russia's indigenizing that capability. You've got North Korean munitions going to Russia, and in return, Russia's sending back know-how and capacity in some of the more high-end capabilities that North Korea is trying to develop. Going both ways between Russia and the PRC, you see both dual-use capacity going from the PRC to Russia that is helping fuel Russia's war machine, and Russia is reciprocating by providing certain types of technological capabilities to China that they've been behind on. So this is something that is going to be a feature of the landscape as we go forward, and it means we're going to have to get better ourselves, and we're going to have to get more integrated with our allies and partners so that our collective industrial might exceeds that of our competitors and adversaries. And then we are also going to have to look for ways through sanctions, export controls, and other restrictive measures to try to put a drag on or reduce or restrict or disrupt that flow that I just described among these actors. But this is a feature of the modern landscape that, in my view, only reinforces the various calls to action that I made in my remarks today.
One of the issues that you mentioned in your remarks is on the subject of munition stockpiles. And if you look at some of the war games that have happened, whether it's here at CSIS or some of the ones that have happened within the Pentagon, you know, one of the things that's interesting with current stockpiles is that with, say, some of our long-range anti-ship missiles, LRASMs, or our extended-range JASMs, we run out pretty quickly in a conflict. So two questions along those lines. And again, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but how serious of an issue is this? How are you thinking about addressing and dealing with addressing it? And you know, along the latter lines too, how does this impact deterrence if we're not effectively able to increase those stockpiles?
This is I think, a significant learning experience for all of us. And by the way, that goes for the U.S., our friends, and our adversaries out of what we've seen unfold in the course of the war against Ukraine. First, it means that we need deeper magazine depth now, which means accelerating and ramping production and trying to reduce what are kind of eye-poppingly long timelines to generate what you and I might not think are a huge number of these high-end systems. LRASMs or JASMs or what have you, or PRISM for that matter, which I referred to in my remarks. So we've got to build the stockpile, build the magazine depth. Second, and the point I made just a minute ago, we have to have the production lines and the skilled workforce ready for surge capacity so that in a conflict situation, we've got warm, kind of turnkey ability to dramatically increase production on demand. I started my speech by talking about our desire to do that with 155 millimeter artillery production. On demand was another 400 rounds a month. I mean, we didn't have it. So part of the defense industrial base has to build that. Third, we have to recognize, as the Ukrainians did, that we're also going to need substitutes for the highest end, most exquisite capabilities. And those substitutes will be cheaper autonomous systems that just come in much greater scale, quantity, that can actually be, to a certain extent, a fill-in for delivering effects, battlefield effects, that aren't identical to what an LRASM could deliver, but at sufficient quantity can help sustain the fight even as you're drawing down your magazine depth. Fourth, we have to think not just about the most high-end, most exquisite capabilities, we also have to think about cheap, attritable stuff, more dumb munitions, frankly, as part of any conflict going forward, and get out of a mindset that says everything has to be the most whiz-bang thing ever. And then the final point that I would make is that another key lesson from Ukraine is the EW environment, the electronic warfare environment in which all of this is happening, and the way in which this is a very dynamic, iterative game where defense gets better, then offense adjusts to overwhelm it, then defense gets better. And so the other thing we have to think about across all of the 4 lines I just described, stockpile surging, attritable systems, dumb munitions, we have to think about how are we building a feedback loop so that everything we built doesn't get neutralized. We actually can adapt it to overcome whatever defenses that we happen to be up against. That has been another critical lesson from Ukraine.
Yeah, it was interesting, my last trip a few months ago to Ukraine, as several folks in Zelensky's office were briefing on the speed with which the battlefield was rapidly evolving on the electronic warfare, the UAV, counter-UAV dimension, just the speed with which things were changing was dramatic. Yeah. And the need to be very adaptive in how to respond. One of the issues you mentioned in your talk was the submarine industrial base. We had, a couple of months ago, we had Mike Waltz and Senator Kelly. It's a bipartisan discussion on the maritime industrial base. And one of the issues that they have highlighted, and others have as well, is more broadly shipbuilding. So I want to read you just briefly the bipartisan congressional report, just one sentence from it, sort of the top line conclusions. Decades of neglect by the U.S. government and private industry has weakened our shipbuilding capacity and maritime workforce, contributing to a declining U.S. flag-shipping fleet to bring American goods to market and support the U.S. military during wartime. There have been other assessments, U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, unclassified assessment. The Chinese have a 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. That's one assessment. That's not how much they're producing, that's a capacity issue. So where do we stand on the broader shipbuilding side, not just the submarine base, and where do we have to go?
Well, first, just diagnosing the problem. A big part of the problem is a skilled workforce issue where we've just lost a skilled workforce in shipbuilding that we need to rebuild, and this administration has put a series of initiatives in place to begin to build that back. Second, we have a huge supply chain problem. Suppliers of the necessary components for ships have disappeared from the United States, or there's one. And we have to rely on that one for any shipbuilding we do, whether it's a U.S. flag commercial carrier, of which we build very, very few, or it's a ship that we're building for a defense requirement. And then third, there are major problems we have in being able to adjust to changes in design over the course of the life of a ship line. And our ability to just have a design, execute it, and churn it out. This is something the Chinese are very good at. We have not proven to be very good at this. Now, part of this is so fundamental and so structural, and it goes back to the early 1980s when the bottom fell out of the American shipbuilding industry, commercial shipbuilding industry. That's not going to reverse overnight. But there are steps that we could take to push back against unfair practices. The Biden administration, accepted a petition for a 301 investigation of Chinese shipbuilding practices that are putting downward pressure on our ability to compete effectively. And then part of it is pick spots where you can get wins and build step by step to get back some of that lost ground over the last few decades. I mentioned very briefly in my remarks something called the ICE Pact, which we entered into with with Finland and with Canada. Finland and Canada are at the cutting edge of polar icebreaker construction and production. The United States has one producer producing basically one cutter for our Coast Guard. We have the capacity to do so much more than that on something that for our allies and partners, the other places they can go are Russia and China, where we really could build this out in concert with Finland and Canada. And for that specialty capability, reinvigorate an aspect of the American shipbuilding base that then we could take to other specialty areas and over time build back a larger capability that would have amazing knock-on effects for our capacity to do naval shipbuilding much more rapidly at much greater scale and at cheaper cost. Because anyone who knows, when we contract for a given ship or line of ships, by the third one being turned out, the cost has gone up dramatically for a variety of reasons that get to supply chain workforce and other things. But part of it is we don't have the backbone of a healthy commercial shipbuilding base to rest our naval shipbuilding on top of. And that's part of the fragility of what we're contending with and why this is going to be such a generational project to fix. We've taken these beginning steps on it and particularly focused on the submarine industrial base because of the centrality of that to our deterrence. But it is a larger issue that Secretary Del Toro has been passionate about, Secretary Austin. I have, dug into the details of workforce development initiatives in this area because it's something that's so core to our national security over time.
So last question before we get to a few audience questions here. Role of other allies and partners. If you look at the shipbuilding industry, both the Koreans and the Japanese have major capabilities. Yeah. We've got some regulations, we've got some congressional acts, including Jones Act, that make some of that more difficult. Should we rethink, make it easier for us to collaborate with some of our partners? That's the first question. And two is AUKUS. How do you think about expanding, or do you think about expanding AUKUS to include more than just the UK and Australia in the future?
So on the first question, I think, I'll leave it to others to debate the relative merits of some of the kind of domestic regulations. I'll just make one, I think, really important point, which is in semiconductors, in clean energy technologies, we've developed a suite of industrial policy tools that are stimulating a revolution in the manufacturing capacity of the United States in these critical sectors. I believe that those same tools, in some cases, those same pots of money could actually attract a Hanwha or another Korean or Japanese shipbuilder to the United States the same way that we've attracted a Samsung or an LG to the or a Hyundai to the United States. And so we should have a theory of stimulating American shipbuilding that is in part about attracting our allies to invest here in building out their capabilities. How we then get into the regulatory landscape for what will work and what wouldn't and the puts and takes of that is harder for me to speak to, but I think the overall theory of the case that we've applied in these other critical sectors could be applied to shipbuilding. There are some green shoots of that in the maritime initiative that Secretary Del Toro has underway. We really need to build on that because that ultimately is going to be an important part of the long-term answer to revitalizing the American shipbuilding industry.
Yeah, and I think it is an area where I think we've got to close that gap. With the Chinese. So one question.
Oh, you said AUKUS. We don't have any plans to expand Pillar 1 of AUKUS, which is the conventionally armed nuclear-powered subs.
Yeah.
We do see other partners coming in to work with us on Pillar 2, which are all of these other advanced.
I've seen the aperture already start to open a bit. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. On questions for the audience, this has nothing to do with the subject of the discussion here, the industrial base, but first question here from someone in the audience is, South Korea's president declared martial law, which he then lifted. What has been the White House response? It looked a little slow from our vantage point. How would you, what has been your response? How concerned have you been with the unfolding events in South Korea?
It's, you're living in a modern information age when entire episode like this unfolds over the course of less than a day, and the characterization of the White House response is slow.
Too slow, yes.
It's like, but it's a fair question. I mean, we were not consulted in any way. We learned about this from the announcement on television the same way the rest of the world did. It raised deep concern for us, this declaration of martial law. The National Assembly worked according to constitutional processes and procedures. The president retracted martial law. Now there's, a series of procedures in place to kind of react to what happened there, and they'll be toing and froing between the main parties in Korea. What we want to see is just the proper functioning of the democratic institutions of the ROK. And after this rather dramatic announcement that raised alarm bells everywhere, including here in Washington, we have seen those processes and procedures work. South Korea's democracy is robust and resilient, and we're going to continue to speak out publicly and engage privately with South Korean counterparts to reinforce the importance of that continuing as we go forward.
Thanks. This question is about the industrial base, and it's an interesting one because it deals with critical minerals. China has banned exports to the U.S. of gallium, germanium, antimony, which have significant military applications in the industrial base. How significant are these actions, and probably more importantly, what are U.S. options to decrease reliance from China on critical minerals?
The most important thing about this is that it is a continuing reminder of the need of the United States to have diverse and resilient supply chains for critical minerals with national security applications, and not to be reliant on any single country, especially a competitor like the PRC. We knew that, we know that, we are reminded of that when they take steps like this. Now, we in particular anticipated this step because they had already moved to restrict germanium and gallium in the past before taking the full move this week to say no more exports to the United States. There are other sources of germanium and gallium in the world, but as we look at the wider aperture of critical minerals, not just for military purposes, but for strategic purposes, semiconductor manufacturing, clean energy, transition technologies, et cetera, we need to get together with like-minded producers, processors, and users of these critical minerals for a high standards critical mineral marketplace that ensures that China can't, for example, crash the price of a given critical mineral, drive mines out of business, reduce the overall global supply, and operate as a chokehold. That's ultimately the logic we need to break. We've taken some really important steps on this in the last few years. It has allowed us to diversify and make more resilient our supply chains, but that too, just like the defense industrial base, is a work in progress. And we need the next administration to continue at working with the Congress and private industry. And I will be the biggest cheerleader of that ongoing effort because it's something we've devoted a lot of attention to over the last 4 years, and something that is going to take, at least the next decade to get ourselves in a position where we can really breathe a sigh of relief. We're there. We're doing better. We have solutions to a lot of these issues, but this is going to be a highly contested space, and there's a lot more work to be done.
Thanks. And last question, it could be brief, from Time Magazine. Is Doge friend or foe in an effort to revitalize the defense industrial base? I mean, what would you say to an effort to look at the Elon Musk initiative?
I just don't know. I mean, I've read, but I don't know what it actually is. Do we need more government efficiency? Of course, we can all use more government efficiency. So at a very macro level, finding ways, as I described in my speech, to modernize, streamline, make more effective procurement, and all of the decades-long rules and regulations of the Defense Department. I laid out a whole list of things in the speech that we should do. Whether this initiative is about that or about something else, I just don't know, so it's hard for me to speak to.
Well, thank you. If you could all join me in thanking Jake for coming to CSIS. And if you could briefly just stay put as we get out, that'd be great, just 30 seconds or so. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to come. Thanks.
switching off. On Miro, the innovation workspace, teams work on an infinite AI-powered canvas. No more silos, no more blank stares, no more productivity tools that aren't very productive. On Canvas, projects ship faster. Why? Because teams are on the same page from idea to outcome. So there's no more dozing off, switching off, or wandering off in different directions. There's better collaboration, problem solving, and AI tools that do things like this. Brief written, next steps agreed, even time to call your mom. Oh, hey, Patty. Miro, Miro on the wall. Who's the fastest of them all? You are, Jenny. You are. Innovation belongs on the canvas. Innovation belongs on Miro.
Well, I feel just like a child. Well, I feel just like a child. Well, I feel just like a child. From my womb to my tomb, I guess I'll always be a child.
PlayStation.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our live coverage of the latest mission from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. I'm Will Robinson Smith, will be conducting our commentary for the duration of this coverage. We are broadcasting, as we always do, from the Spaceflight Now News Bureau here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Our Stephen Young is running the technical operations of the broadcast tonight. Our Adam Bernstein is out preparing to track the rocket and do some still photography as well. Our other photographer, Michael Kane, has this evening off, but if you'd like to follow their photography, you can find the fellows over on X, formerly known as Twitter, at ABurnNYC for Adam and at MD Kane Jr. for Michael. While you're over there, be sure to follow Spaceflight Now simply at Spaceflight Now. You can also find us on Threads as well as Blue Sky and Facebook. We'll also be joined in assistance with tracking this mission tonight by our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images. Currently T-minus 56 minutes, 3 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff of this Falcon 9 rocket. Said to be the first of a pair of overnight launches for SpaceX. One from the East Coast, one from the West Coast. On board this particular Falcon 9 rocket are 24 Starlink V2 mini satellites nestled within the payload fairings at the top of the rocket. The booster you see at the base, not as sooty as a lot of the other boosters currently flying for SpaceX, as this one has only flown 5 times before, going for its 6th mission tonight. We'll talk a little bit more about its booster history as we continue on through this countdown. And as we've been keeping an eye on weather conditions, you may have heard through our microphone station out there that the strong wind warning, which had been in effect for much of Kennedy Space Center as well as the Cape, has been allowed to expire. Before we began our live broadcast, they also ended a Phase 1 lightning watch. So conditions are starting to mellow out here on Florida's Space Coast as we continue to cruise on towards the planned launch of this Falcon 9 rocket at the midnight hour tonight. We'll talk with a little more specificity about the weather outlook and what the 45th Weather Squadron had to say in just a little bit here. But first off, I want to thank the more than 1,300 of you who are joining with us live tonight. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor. Click the like button to allow more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage as we continue to roll along. Also want to thank our wonderful moderators in the live chat who are helping us out tonight. Our thanks to Astro Jen, Callistia Lee for joining us this evening, as well as Astro Joe. I want to thank Rusty Shackelford for his help earlier on in the day over on our 24-hour live stream, that being Launchpad Live. If you happen to see any of the other moderators join us in the live stream tonight, go ahead and give them a big hello. And for all of our viewers who are joining from here in the United States, hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. If you've already begun your Black Friday shopping, hope that has been fruitful for you and you've found some things that will make some folks in your life very happy in the months to come.
Every second, our heart expands and contracts to pump blood throughout the body. Our heartbeats are controlled by electrical impulses that can be detected by electrocardiography, also known as ECG or EKG. ECG is an essential tool for physicians to diagnose heart disease, but ECG signal quality is sensitive to the effectiveness of electrode contact. Poor contact can result in noisy artifacts, making the signal uninterpretable. Let's revisit the heart's circuitry and simplify it to a single wire carrying an electric current. Electric currents induce a complementary magnetic field. If we had a magnetic field camera to capture the field components pointing out of the screen, this is what we would see. And if the direction of the current flow changes, so does the image. Unlike ECG, these magnetic fields of the heart propagate through the body virtually unperturbed and can be detected with sensitive magnetometers. This is called magnetocardiography, or MCG. MCG can act as a magnetic field camera, recording images and videos of the magnetic field of the heart. In a heart attack, blood flow in the coronary arteries is reduced, causing damage to the heart tissue. The damaged region changes the flow of current in the heart, similar to how tilting or bending our current-carrying wire changes the